Tiananmen Square. I don't know if you remember that, but there was the guy in front of the tank. They called him Tank Boy. So if we look that up now real quick, and we look up, a picture of Tank Boy,
where he's just standing in front of the tank,
and what happens? The tank tries to move around him, right?
Yep.
So, do you remember him being run over by the tank or not? Now we have this thing called the Mandela effect, which we can go into.
Can you please explain this? Yeah.
So the Mandela effect is when a certain group of people remember a event or a object or a movie that is different from the way that it is today. And so it was coined by a blogger named Fiona Broom, and it's named after Nelson Mandela, because some people believe that Mandela got, instead of getting out of prison, he died.
In prison
in the 80s or early 90s. Whereas in our timeline, that didn't happen, right? He actually got out of prison, became the president of, the leader of the party, and became president of South Africa, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he died in, I forget what year it was. I think it was 2013 or
something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And so, a subset of people remember this alternate timeline. And then, she started to find other instances of this. I think it was at one of these Comic-Con type conventions, like Dragon Con, I think it was called, the one they have in Atlanta, where there were a bunch of fans that, with the Star Trek actors from the original Star Trek series were on stage. And the fans remembered this episode. And the guys on stage are like, we never filmed this episode. What are you talking about? And they insisted they could quote dialogue from this episode.
Whoa.
And Star Trek fans, some of them are pretty intense.
They know their shit.
They know their shit, right? And so I always had dismissed the Mandela effect as, well, it's just a bunch of faulty memory. The famous ones are like the Bernstein Bears versus the Bernstein. Like if you bring it up, you can see, that it's actually Bernstein Bear. If you just search for Mandela effects.
Mandela effect Bernstein.
Yeah, not even Bernstein. You'll probably see a bunch of them. If you just search for Mandela effect, you'll see images.
Okay. Yeah, let's pull that up. All right. Images. Beautiful. Okay. The Bernstein Bears, the Bernstein Bears.
Yeah, and so the way it is today is that they're the Bernstein Bears, and yet many people remember them as the Bernstein Bears, the S-T-E-I-N.
You know what's crazy?
Yeah.
I vaguely remember them as the Bernstein Bears.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. It's in there floating somewhere around. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. And then, another famous one is the line from The Empire Strikes Back, where everyone thinks Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father." But he actually doesn't say that. He says, "No, I am your father." Instead of "Luke, I am your father."
That's something that that one I feel like could have been changed in pop culture, because so many people just said it. Like maybe it's like the butterfly effect. Someone says it one way one time, and that's such a memorable line. It's personal. You're calling out a name. Then people start repeating it. Then suddenly it becomes a pop culture phenomenon, and the rest is history. I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about with the Mandela effect is fascinating.
Yeah. And so, I dismissed most of these as like a little memory lapse or a pop culture thing. But then you get into what I call proximity and significance. So meaning if you were close to a particular event or it had some significance in your life, then you're more likely to remember it correctly. And so I've divided them into categories. And some of these that are just like one or two letters different, or a movie line that's different, I think they could very much just be people misremembering them from pop culture. But if it's more significant for you, like the Star Trek episode, right, that you've seen, or many people remember the movie Kazam and Shazam, right, with Sinbad. So people insist there was a movie. In fact, let's look it up. I even forget which one is the real movie. So people thought there was a movie in the 90s with Sinbad in there about a genie called, I think it was supposed to be called Shazam. And people are like, no, I insist. I had the VHS tape and I watched it like many times.
Like a lot of people are saying
this? A decent, still a subset. It's not a majority, but it's a subset. And so if you look at the images, you can kind of see that there was actually a movie called Kazam, I think, if I'm getting the two right. Oddly enough, sometimes it seems like there's weird Mandela effects going on with this. And
Kazam with Shaq. I've seen that movie.
With Shaq, right? But people insist, no, this was a separate movie from Kazam with Jack. So if you go to the images, you'll see people have drawn, images of Sinbad. And this got to the point where Sinbad actually recorded a scene from this movie that people had described to him in 2017, just for fun.
Oh, just to fuck with him.
Just to fuck with him. To say, people say I was in this movie, but I actually wasn't.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy because like also thinking about it on a more micro scale, you have when you look at like trial testimony and what's useful and what's not, they always talk about how eyewitness testimony is actually often the least useful because stories change in our mind and we actually believe we saw things over time, whether it was we were coached to believe that or, we had some traumatic event that we witnessed and you're in such shock that then you play it back and you start to reason your way through it and you start to see things that maybe you didn't. And this to me could be part of a very similar type phenomenon, no?
Some of them could be. And so, again, that's kind of what I assumed originally. And then I had a friend of mine from MIT who was visiting Google. He worked for Google and was visiting me in Mountain View. And he goes, you ever heard of this Mandela effect? Yeah, I heard of it. People with false memories or faulty memories. He goes, well, the best explanation is, some kind of simulated reality. Because if you rerun the simulation, little things will change along the way. Mm. And so it gets back to proximity and significance. So if something is significant for you and multiple people remember it that way, then you're more likely to have gotten it right and less likely to have gotten it wrong. So for example, Nelson Mandela, there was this one blogger, I don't remember her name now, but on YouTube where she said that she was a journalism student and she was supposed to go visit Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And she actually went there, but they said he was too ill for her to actually visit him. And so she came back and she started working for NPR. And then she heard he died and saw his funeral and his wife, Winnie. And so this is somebody that actually went to South Africa to meet with him. So it was much closer, much more significant. So the Star Trek example is another one. I mean, there are folks whose parents are like evangelical Christians and they really followed the Reverend Billy Graham. And I don't know what year he died, but there's a whole group of people that say that he died, they remember getting the magazine in the mail, like Billy Graham, this is the year he died, many years before he actually died. Mm. And so they feel like it's changed. And that's where we get into some real more significant items like scripture. People remember their scripture exactly, right? So if you look at Isaiah in scripture, there's whole websites dedicated to biblical changes. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Isaiah, there's the line about the lion and the lamb. If you look at it now, if you look up Isaiah, lion and the lamb, you'll see there's no actual line about the lion and the lamb. It says the wolf will lay with the lamb or something like that.
So this is another, okay. In the Bible, Isaiah 11:6-7 describes a time when the lion and the lamb will live together in peace along with other animals and a child will lead them. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the lion and the fatling together and a little child shall lead them.
Right. And so, but most people remember the line of the lion and the lamb.
But they're not together.
And, when you get to scripture, you're in a place where people do memorize things exactly in different religions. And so this is what really got me thinking, okay, is there a possible explanation? And whether you believe in the Mandela effect or not, I think it's a useful way to think about rerunning multiple timelines. And that's where I came up with this idea of the simulated multiverse, that if you rerun the events, some things will be different, just like with the butterfly effect. If you change a few variables, and that really was what Philip K. Dick was talking about. And that got me thinking about what would it mean in a computational multiverse? Could we have memories of a previous run of the simulation, for example, where you remember things happening differently?
When you say like computational multiverse, though, versus in my head, I'm just thinking of like a multiverse where it wouldn't necessarily be a simulation on the other end. What would be? I don't even want to ask that. Like, what would be the main differences in how the multiverse behaves if one's computational and another theory says it's not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And before we get into that, let me just do one more Mandela effect. And
Sure.
We'll get into what it means to be in a computational multiverse and how is it possible some people might remember something that's done differently. So another one that was most significant, that was very significant, I thought, was the Tiananmen Square. I don't know if you remember that, but there was the guy in front of the tank. They called him Tank Boy. So if we look that up now real quick, and we look up, a picture of Tank Boy,
Where he's just standing in front of the tank.
and what happens? The tank tries to move around him, right?
Yep.
So, do you remember him being run over by the tank or not?
No, I think they got him out of the way. Right?
That's what I remember, and that's what the main timeline says. But there are a number of people who actually remember that he was run over, and they said it was the bloodiest thing they ever saw on TV by the tank. And that is one of those weird, interesting memories that for some people has more significance than other people. And so when we get into scripture or we get into events that might have more significance, is it possible that these people are actually remembering something that was significant to them? So perhaps it's not just faulty memory in some cases. And so I came up with this idea. Could it be that those memories are still there? So when we run a computational, so every program, like if you're running a computer right now, people are probably watching this on their phone or on a computer, there's actually multiple processes running at the same time. But they don't run exactly the same. If there's an actual CPU, what happens is the CPU will run, say, Microsoft Word for a little bit, and then it'll go and it'll run, some other program like Zoom or YouTube for a number of cycles, and it'll go back and forth, but it does it quickly enough that it seems like it's all happening simultaneously. But what happens in computer science, there's this thing called garbage cleaning. So if you're rerunning a process, you may be using the same memory that a garbage collection that you ran before. But what happens is that sometimes the previous values are still there in memory. And so what garbage collection does is it goes and it cleans up those values and sets them to zero. But it only runs every so often. And so it's possible that you still have values there in memory of a previous run of that same program. And so that's one of the differences when you think of a computational multiverse. If it's using the same kinds of computation, then it's very possible that that's what's going on. Philip K. Dick also, wrote a story that was turned into a movie called The Adjustment Bureau.
That was Matt Damon, right?
Matt Damon and Emily Blunt. And that was based on a story called The Adjustment Team, in which case there's a guy, he goes to work, I think Fletcher was his name, and suddenly he sees that everything's frozen at work. And the adjustment team is like changing things. And then when they start up again, everyone just remembers things as they've been adjusted. They don't remember how it was before, everyone in his office. But he remembers before because he wasn't part of the adjustment. He remembers exactly what the office looked like and how people were dressed and everything was different. And so, the movie's a little bit different from the book, but it's the basic idea. And so what happened was Tessa said that he went into the bathroom to turn on the light. And he was like trying to pull a chain. If you remember, there's the old chain lines. But instead, it was an actual switch. And he said, "This is weird. I've been here 100 times. I've done this, this is our apartment. I've done this many times. It wasn't a light switch. It was a chain, or maybe it's the other way around. It was a chain, not a light switch, or it was a switch, not a chain." And she said that's what gave him the idea to write that particular story is maybe what if somebody's actually adjusting things in the world around us, and then
we were saying,
stop and then rerun it. And so that's what the way I think of a computational multiverse. Now, there's a whole area of quantum computing. So just recently, Google announced a new quantum computing chip. It's called Willow, I think, for example.
Yeah, it was a little scary, that press release.
Yeah. And
Shit could do a lot.
Yeah, and in that press release, one of the folks at Google, I think, said, well, the reason we're able to do this particular computation so fast is because we're using the multiverse and we're actually computing in all these different multiverses. Now, the basic idea is that in a quantum computer, you can do things much more quickly than you would be able to do them using a standard computer. Certain problems that grow exponentially are very hard for computers to do. And, exponential growth is when a number grows based on the exponent growing, it just grows really fast. And probably the best story or example of a problem like that is the king from India and the sage and the chess game. And so what happens, the king loved to play chess, but nobody wanted to play with him anymore. And there was this sort of wise man, and he said, well, if you play chess with me, I'll give you anything you want if you win. And then the wise sage says, okay, how about this? If I win, you'll give me 1 grain of rice for the first chess square at the bottom of the board. And then in the next square, you'll put 2 grains of rice. And then 4 grains of rice. And then 8 and 16. So he's doubling it each time. So it's like 2 to the power of X. And the king is like, sure, I mean, why not? That's pretty simple. But it turns out that if you keep doing that, you get to a very large number. You get to 2 to the 64. And it was like more grains of rice than you could fit, like in all of India, for example.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a computational problem that grows exponentially. And so quantum computing, theoretically, the idea is that it can have qubits instead of regular bits. So regular bit has a value of 0 or 1. Right? And like we talked about earlier,
Yep.
Just the simplest unit of information, yes or no, 0 or 1. A qubit is a bit that is in superposition. So we go back to what we were talking about earlier, Schrodinger's cat.
Yes.
We said the cat was in superposition, meaning it was both alive and dead. So it occupied both states, a superset of the states. That's where that term comes from in mathematics, superposition. So the idea is if you have, let's say, 2 bits right next to each other, usually the possible number of values is 2 to the power of 2. It's just 4. Or 3, if you have 3 bits, the number of possible values is 2 to the power of 3, or 8, or 16 for 4 bits, right? So those are all now, it's pretty easy for a computer to look at 16 different possibilities and figure out which one works. That happens very quickly. But when you get to these large numbers, like 2 to the power of 64,
It gets
or
hard.
2 to the power of 128 bits,
Yep.
or 512 bits. That takes thousands of years, basically, for the computer to explore every single one of those possibilities.
Does that change if we get to quantum computing, though?
Well, that's the idea, is that eventually in quantum computing, if you can basically put the bits into superposition, they're called qubits, Qubits, then you can explore all the values at the same time inside different parallel universes.
What in the technology allows us to do that? Like, can you explain that mechanism?
Well, the mechanism is one that's like, it's a little weird because different companies are doing it differently. But the way they're doing it is that they're trying to put a particle or a molecule or some very small item, a photon, an electron. They're trying to put that into superposition. Because we know, that's what the double slit experiment was about.
Yeah.
It was about sending through electrons initially and then photons. And then later, they believe that even larger molecules actually exist in a state of superposition as well with probability waves. So it's really weird. Like once you get into this, none of this stuff makes any sense from a common sense perspective. And so the basic idea of quantum computing is that theoretically, you should be able to explore all the possible values. Now, theoretically is one thing. Doing it in practice is very hard. And so quantum computing is still like back at where we were in the 50s and 60s, right? It requires room-sized computers. And one of the problems is that particles get entangled. And when they get entangled, they cohere and they decohere, which means they're errors that pop up. And so if you just try to put one little qubit into a 0 or 1 superposition, and then it comes back to a 1, you could have it basically flip. Like it's kind of like when I was at MIT, we built like computers ourselves, like from the ground up.
What a flex. When I was at MIT, we built computers. Another Tuesday.
Yeah, it was a whole semester thing it took. And it was like this big board and we were like putting wires in things. But what happened was at one point I couldn't figure out what the hell was wrong. Like why wasn't it giving me the right answer? And it turns out there was just some physical problem where some wire got crossed and the value got changed.
Yes.
And so this happens over the internet. Like if people are watching this over the internet, they've got the bits from the server on their computer. How did they know they got the right bits? Because it turns out physical wires are actually error prone. And because if you look at it, if you go way down to the bottom level, a 1 is represented as like 5 volts or 10 volts or some number of volts, and a 0 means like 0 to like 1 volt or something like that. So you've got these values, but they can get easily messed up in the physical world, and that's what happens with quantum computing. So there's a whole series of error codes, correction codes that get put into place. And there was a guy named Huffman, and then there was a guy named Claude Shannon, who's like the father of information theory, who was at Bell Labs at MIT back in the 50s and 40s. And they came up with all these different ideas for how do you minimize the number of errors. And the basic way you minimize errors is you duplicate some information. And you say, okay, here's a string of, let's say, 10 bits. And you just count the number of ones. Let's say there's 3 ones in there. And then you add the number 3 at the end of the transmission. So when you get it, you look at those 10 bits, but you look at the little thing at the end that says there should be 3 ones. And if there's more than 3 ones, you know something's wrong.
Wrong, yeah.
And if there's something less than 3 ones, you know there's something wrong.
Right.
So then you ask for the bits again. It means something went wrong. And so this has been the problem with qubits in quantum computers, is the physical way they implement the bits has made it very error prone. So you end up having to run like 1,000 times the same procedure to make sure it comes out correct. Because then if you actually run like a quantum computer, people can do this. The IBM, you can like actually go up and literally upload your quantum computing code and have it run, and it'll tell you I ran it 90.
Can?
Yeah, ran like 100 times, and 97 times this is the value I got, and 3 times this is the value I got. So therefore, the 97 is the correct value. The 3 were errors, basically.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.